I'm desperate for a man's warmth, giant Apache girl, said widowed rancher. The harsh winds of the winter night blew fiercely across the rolling plains, bringing with it the biting cold that seemed to freeze the very air. Frowned and despairing in a storm. That is the day when Marion frowned on his. The girl outside was nothing but a blur of snow, wind, and darkness, but it didn't bother her. The silence of the cold and the isolation she felt had become a part of her life. A constant, ever-present companion. Breaths. Her husband had passed away 2 winters ago, and since that moment Catherine had never quite found peace. She had tried to carry on as best as she could, but the reality of running the ranch alone was nothing like the life they had shared. Before his death, her husband had always been there, strong and reliable, tending to the cattle, fixing fences, and making decisions. But now it was just Catherine. She had inherited everything. The ranch, the animals, the responsibilities, but she had also inherited the overwhelming weight of it all. The mornings began before the sun even peeked over the horizon. There was no time for a break, no time to mourn. The land demanded attention, and Catherine knew that if she didn't give it, the ranch would fall apart. The cattle had to be fed, the fences had to be checked, and the horses needed to be exercised. There were no holidays, no respite, just the unending cycle of work that never stopped, even when the storms raged or the temperatures dropped to unbearable lows. Her hands had become calloused from the work. Her once soft skin was now cracked and rough. Her face had a hardened look, a reflection of the many winters she had faced alone. Despite the physical toll the work had taken on her, it was the emotional burden that was far harder to carry. Catherine had never been one to show weakness. She had always prided herself on her independence, but that didn't stop the loneliness from creeping in, especially in the stillness of the long winter nights. The house was too quiet now. She had grown used to the sound of her husband's laughter, the clink of tools in the barn, and the soft rustling of paper as he read by the fire. Now the only sounds were the wind outside, the crackling of the fire, and her own heartbeat, loud and unyielding in the silence. At night, when she finally lay down to sleep, her bed seemed too large, too empty. The bed, once shared with her husband, now felt cold and distant, no matter how many blankets she piled on. Narration. The winters here were unforgiving. They were long and harsh, stretching on for months. Bet. Catherine had never known a life without the cold. She had been born here on this ranch, raised by her parents who had worked the same land. They had taught her how to be tough, how to survive in this unforgiving world. But even the strongest of people needed warmth. And now Catherine found herself craving something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. Companionship, the warmth of another person, the feeling of being needed. The reassurance that even in the coldest times, someone else was there. The storm outside was only getting worse. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, and the wind howled through the trees like some wild creature clawing at the windows. Catherine drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat down by the fire. The flames danced in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She gazed into the fire, trying to quiet the ache in her heart. Her thoughts drifted to her husband, to the times when they had sat together like this, their hands clasped, their eyes tired but content. She missed him more than she could express, but she had learned to keep that pain locked away. The fire crackled and popped, the only sound in the room. Catherine had always found comfort in the crackling of wood in the fire, the warmth it provided on a bitterly cold night. But tonight, even the fire couldn't fill the emptiness she felt inside. It was as though the warmth it gave was only skin deep, not enough to chase away the deeper chill that had settled into her bones. She glanced up at the clock on the wall. It was late, far too late for anyone to be traveling in this kind of weather. Yet the sudden sound of a knock on the door caught her off guard. It was so unexpected that for a moment she didn't know how to react. Who would be out here in this storm? The nearest neighbor was miles away. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to assume it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks. But the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a muffled voice. "Hello? Is anyone inside?" Catherine stood up quickly, startled. She wasn't used to visitors, especially in the middle of a storm like this. She moved cautiously toward the door, her mind racing with questions. Who could it be? Narration. Was it someone in need of help? A lost traveler? Or perhaps someone from the nearby town who had gotten caught in the storm? Whatever it was, she knew she couldn't leave them outside to freeze. With a deep breath, Catherine opened the door, stepping back as the cold air rushed in. Standing in front of her, covered in snow and windblown, was a tall woman. Bet she was wearing a thick, worn coat, but it did little to protect her from the freezing cold. Her face was red from the cold, but her eyes, despite the exhaustion, held a certain strength. Her hair, long and dark, was tangled with snowflakes. She was taller than most women Catherine had seen, easily a head taller than herself. Her broad shoulders and muscular build were hard to miss. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice rough from the cold. "I'm lost. I need shelter for the night. The storm caught me, and I can't make it back to my camp." Catherine blinked in surprise. Bad. She had never seen this woman before, and yet there was something about her that seemed familiar, as though she belonged here, in this wild land. Catherine hesitated, but the kindness in the woman's eyes, combined with the desperation in her voice, made it impossible to turn her away. "Come inside," Catherine said, stepping aside to let the stranger in. The woman nodded gratefully and stepped into the warmth of the house.
"Thank you," she said, brushing the snow from her coat and shaking out her long hair.
"I don't know what I would have done out there." Catherine closed the door behind her, feeling the warmth from the fire radiate against the cold air that had followed the woman inside. "It's no trouble," Catherine replied, though she was still unsure what to make of this unexpected guest. "You're safe now." As the woman warmed up by the fire, Catherine studied her. There was something striking about her presence, a certain aura of strength and self-assuredness that Catherine couldn't quite place. She wasn't sure who this woman was or where she had come from, but there was a feeling that her arrival was no mere coincidence. The storm outside raged on, but inside the warmth of the fire filled the room. As Catherine stared into the flames, she couldn't help but wonder what had brought this woman to her door, and whether her arrival would change things in ways Catherine wasn't yet prepared to understand. The woman moved closer to the fire, her boots heavy with snow. As she shed her coat, Catherine couldn't help but notice the way she carried herself. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and strong. Her body seemed built for the harsh world outside, a world Catherine had always known but never quite had the strength to embrace fully. This woman, on the other hand, seemed like someone who was born to face those challenges head-on. "Are you hungry?" Catherine asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice felt small compared to the storm outside, but she knew the invitation was necessary. "No one who had been out in that kind of weather could go without food and warmth for long." The woman nodded gratefully. "Yes, I could use something to eat," she said, her voice rough but sincere. "I haven't eaten in a while." The house was small, and the kitchen was a cozy, familiar space, filled with the smell of stew simmering on the stove. Catherine worked quickly, though her mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? How had she come to be out in the storm? And why had she ended up on her doorstep so unexpectedly? While Catherine worked, the woman stood by the fire, letting the heat of the flames soak into her cold skin. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant as though she were contemplating something far away. There was a certain sadness in her expression, a weariness that spoke of struggles Catherine couldn't yet understand. "Where are you from?" Catherine asked, breaking the silence again as she set a steaming bowl of soup on the table. She glanced at the woman, who had taken a seat by the fire, rubbing her hands together. The woman looked up, meeting Catherine's gaze. There was a brief hesitation, as though she were choosing her words carefully. "Broad. I'm from the Apache tribe," she said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and sorrow. "My name is Tallulah." She had heard of the Apache people, of course, but living out here she had little interaction with anyone beyond the occasional neighbor or traveling merchant. The tribes were something distant, something separate from her life. But now, sitting across from this woman, Tallulah, it felt different. Catherine had heard of the Apache strength and resilience, their ability to survive in harsh conditions, but seeing it before her in the form of this woman sitting by the fire with a look of quiet strength was something else entirely. Tallulah. Catherine repeated the name softly, testing it on her tongue. It felt foreign but beautiful. I've lived here all my life. Tallulah nodded in return. I've been traveling, she explained. My tribe, we've had some difficulties. The land has become harder to live on, and we've had to move farther out. I've been alone for a while now, trying to find a place where we can survive. The storm caught me off guard. Catherine listened closely, the weight of Tallulah's words settling over her. Grasp. She could understand the feeling of being alone, of searching for something, or someone, that could provide stability. Catherine had lost her husband, and she too had been left to navigate the harshness of the world on her own. But hearing Tallulah's story, hearing the strain in her voice, made Catherine realize just how different their lives were, despite their shared solitude.
"I'm sorry," Catherine said, her voice soft with sympathy.
That must be difficult. Tallulah gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. We survive, she said simply, as though the words themselves held a kind of quiet wisdom. It's what we do. We survive. Catherine didn't know how to respond to that. She had never known survival in the same way. For her, survival meant working the land, keeping the ranch alive. It meant feeding the animals, fixing the fences, and doing what had to be done, day after day. But she had never faced the kind of uncertainty that Tallulah had, the kind that came from losing everything and having to fight for every inch of land, every scrap of food. They ate together in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. The meal was simple: soup, bread, and a few herbs Catherine had dried herself. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the moment. The warmth of the food seemed to revive Tallulah, who ate slowly but with gratitude. As they finished, Catherine cleared the table, but neither woman moved to leave the warmth of the fire. There was something comforting in the quiet presence of another person, even though neither of them had spoken much. The bond between them, though still fragile, was beginning to take root. So Catherine said, after a long pause, "How long have you been traveling alone?"
"For a few months now," she replied. "I've been moving from place to place trying to find some peace."
"But it's hard. The land doesn't give easily." And the people. She trailed off, her gaze turning inward. There was an edge to her words, something Catherine didn't fully understand, but could feel in the way Tallulah held herself. It was as though she had seen too much, experienced too much, and was tired of fighting for acceptance. "What's been the hardest part?" Catherine asked quietly, unable to resist the urge to know more. It was the kind of question that felt too personal, too probing, but Catherine couldn't help herself. There was something about Tallulah, the way she seemed so strong and yet so fragile, that made Catherine want to reach out, to understand her. Tallulah's eyes flicked to Catherine's, her expression momentarily guarded. "The hardest part," she began slowly, "is not knowing where I belong. Not knowing if there's a place left for me, for us." Her voice trembled just slightly, betraying the depth of the pain she had been carrying. "I've been searching for something, for some kind of connection, but it's hard when you're always moving, always alone."
Catherine felt a pang of recognition.
Bay. She knew that feeling, the feeling of being disconnected from the world around her, of yearning for something she couldn't quite grasp. She had lived with it for so long after her husband's death. "I know how that feels," Catherine said softly. "I've been alone too, for a long time." Tallulah looked at her, her gaze steady but filled with understanding. There was something about the way she looked at Catherine that made her feel like they were no longer two strangers in a storm, but two women bound by their shared loneliness, their shared need for something more. "Phew, you don't have to be alone," Tallulah said quietly, her voice soft but sure. "Not tonight." The words hung in the air, the weight of them settling between them like a promise. Rat. Catherine wasn't sure what it meant, wasn't sure what could come from it. But she knew one thing. In that moment she didn't feel so alone anymore. As the storm raged on outside, Catherine and Tallulah sat in the warmth of the fire, no longer just a rancher and a traveler, but two women who had found something in each other's company. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long while it was enough. The days following Tallulah's arrival passed in a blur of hard work and quiet companionship. The storm had eventually faded, leaving behind a crisp, clear sky, but the chill lingered. Free. Catherine went about her chores, but now she had help. Tallulah, strong and capable, seemed to find work in every corner of the ranch. It wasn't just the physical labor, though. It was the way she moved through the tasks with an ease Catherine hadn't seen in years. The ranch, which had felt too big and heavy for one person to manage, seemed more manageable with Tallulah at her side. Together they fed the cattle, checked the fences, and cleaned the stables. Hooray. Tallulah, with her broad shoulders and confident stride, was a stark contrast to Catherine, whose smaller frame was worn from years of tending to the land alone. Yet, despite their differences, they worked well together. Tallulah had an unspoken way of knowing what needed to be done, often anticipating Catherine's next move. It was as though she had been raised to understand the land in a way that came naturally, as if it was in her blood. In the evenings, when the work was done and the house quieted, the two women sat by the fire, talking or simply enjoying the silence. The warmth of the flames was a comfort, but it was the presence of another person that made the house feel less empty. Catherine had grown accustomed to the silence, but having Tallulah around filled a space she hadn't even realized was there. At first, there had been an awkwardness between them, a tension born from the stark differences in their backgrounds. Catherine was a rancher, raised in the ways of the land, while Tallulah came from a tribe, her world shaped by traditions that Catherine knew little about. Yet, as the days passed, that tension began to dissolve, replaced by a mutual respect that had grown between them. One morning, Catherine woke early to the sound of horses whinnying outside. She rubbed her eyes and stretched, pulling on her boots as she made her way to the door. Tallulah was already outside, standing by the stable, her tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Catherine stepped out into the cold, the frost crunching beneath her feet, and walked over to join her. "The horses seem restless," Catherine said, her voice rough with sleep. "What's going on?" Tallulah turned to her, her eyes sharp and alert. "They've sensed something," she said quietly. "There's movement in the distance. It could be anything. A predator, maybe." I don't know. Catherine looked out over the land, her gaze searching the horizon, but all she saw were the rolling plains, the distant hills, and the faint outline of trees. The wind had picked up, and the sky was overcast, making it hard to see much beyond a few hundred yards. Still, there was an unease in Tallulah's voice that Catherine couldn't ignore.
"I'll go check," Tallulah said, her tone calm but determined.
She turned to Catherine, adding, "Stay here. It's better if I go alone."
Catherine opened her mouth to protest, but Tallulah's gaze was firm, and for a moment, Catherine found herself speechless. There was something about Tallulah's presence, her strength and quiet confidence, that made her trust her completely.
Fast. So, instead of arguing, Catherine simply nodded. Tallulah mounted one of the horses with ease, her movements fluid and sure. She glanced back at Catherine, offering a brief smile before she spurred the horse into motion. Catherine watched her ride off, her heart heavy with a mixture of concern and admiration. She didn't like the feeling of waiting, of being left behind, but she knew Tallulah could handle whatever was out there. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky, but Tallulah had not yet returned. Catherine busied herself with the work that still needed to be done, trying to distract herself from the worry gnawing at her insides. She fed the cattle, checked the fences, and made sure the house was secure. But all the while, her thoughts kept drifting back to Tallulah. It wasn't until the late afternoon that Tallulah finally returned. She rode in slowly, her horse moving at a steady pace. Catherine hurried out to meet her, her heart pounding in her chest. "What happened?" Catherine asked, her voice filled with concern. "Is everything all right?"
Tallulah dismounted and gave her a tired but reassuring smile.
"Everything's fine," she said, brushing off the dust from her coat. "There was nothing out there. Just a deer." "Right. The horses were reacting to its scent, nothing more." Catherine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm glad it wasn't something more dangerous." Tallulah nodded, her expression softening. "It's good to be cautious, though." "Out here, you never know what might be lurking. It's a habit we've had to learn over the years." Catherine couldn't help but admire Tallulah's calm demeanor, the way she took everything in stride. It was a stark contrast to Catherine's own tendency to worry, to second-guess every decision. There was something freeing about Tallulah's approach to life, a sense of quiet strength that Catherine found both comforting and inspiring.
As the days went on, Tallulah continued to be a steady presence in Catherine's life.
The two women worked side by side, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Tallulah, with her quiet wisdom, had a way of making the ranch feel less like a burden and more like a shared responsibility. Catherine, in turn, had something to offer Tallulah. A home, a place where she could rest, a sense of stability that the world outside seemed to lack. One evening, as the two of them sat by the fire, Tallulah spoke about her life back with her tribe. Catherine listened intently, drawn into the stories of Tallulah's people, of their traditions, and the way they lived off the land. Tallulah's voice was low and steady as she spoke, and Catherine could hear the pride in her words, despite the sadness that lingered just beneath the surface.
"We were once free," Tallulah said.
"We moved with the seasons, following the herds and the rivers. We were part of the land, part of everything. But things have changed. The land isn't the same, and the people aren't the same." "We've had to fight for everything we have, and now, it feels like we're losing." Catherine felt a pang of sympathy understanding the weight of Tallulah's words. She had never faced such a battle, never had to fight for her place in the world in the same way. But the loneliness she had felt, the feeling of being lost and adrift, was something she could relate to. "I don't know how you do it," Catherine said softly. How you keep going, keep fighting. Tallulah looked at her, her eyes searching, as though weighing her words carefully. You do what you have to do, she said simply. You find a way to survive, even when it seems impossible. Catherine nodded, her mind drifting back to her own struggles. She had been surviving too. But in the presence of Tallulah, she began to wonder if perhaps surviving wasn't enough. Perhaps there was something more she could find, something that went beyond the constant grind of work and loneliness. Perhaps there was a way to live, truly live, with another person by her side. That night, as Catherine lay in bed, she thought about the days that had passed, about the quiet companionship she had found with Tallulah, the warmth of their shared meals, the comfort of their conversations, and the way Tallulah seemed to fill the spaces Catherine hadn't even realized were empty. There was a stillness in her heart that had been there for so long, a stillness that had kept her locked in a world of solitude. But now, for the first time in years, it was beginning to fade. Catherine didn't know what the future would bring, or what role Tallulah would play in her life. But in that moment, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The future might be uncertain, but for the first time in ages, Catherine was no longer facing it alone. As the days turned into weeks, Catherine and Tallulah's bond deepened. They had grown comfortable in each other's company, their silences as meaningful as their conversations. The ranch was no longer just a place of solitude for Catherine. It had become a shared space where two women, each with their own history and heartaches, could begin to heal. But despite the growing closeness between them, the reality of their differences began to weigh on Catherine. She had never thought much about the world beyond her small ranch. She had been so focused on survival, on keeping the ranch running, that she had never truly understood the struggles of people like Tallulah. The Apache tribe, with their customs, their way of life, seemed worlds apart from the life Catherine had known. But Tallulah had become more than a guest, more than a stranger in her home. She had become a part of Catherine's life, and that raised questions Catherine wasn't sure how to answer. One evening, as the two of them sat by the fire, Catherine found herself staring at the flames, her thoughts swirling. She could feel the warmth of the fire, but inside there was a coldness, a hesitation she couldn't shake. "You've never really talked much about your tribe," Catherine said, her voice softer than usual. "What's it like, being a part of them? I mean, what's it really like?" Tallulah had been quiet for a long while, her gaze fixed on the fire. She looked deep in thought, her expression unreadable. Fire. Finally she spoke, her voice low but clear. "It's not as simple as it used to be," she said slowly.
Once we were a people who lived off the land. We followed the seasons, moved with the animals, and lived as part of nature.
It was a way of life that was sacred to us. But now, everything is different. The land is no longer ours, and the world around us doesn't understand our ways.
Catherine nodded, her heart heavy.
She had always been proud of her independence, proud of the way she worked the land. But she knew her life was different. She had never faced the same kind of struggle Tallulah had. She had never fought for her home, for her way of life. "Do you miss it?" Catherine asked quietly. "Your tribe, I mean. Do you ever wish you could go back?" Tallulah's expression softened, and for the first time, Catherine saw a vulnerability she hadn't noticed before. "I don't know," Tallulah said after a moment. "Part of me does. There's a part of me that wants to return to that life, to feel the connection to the land, to my people. But another part of me feels like that life is gone. Desperation, and maybe, just maybe, it's better to move forward."
Catherine wasn't sure what to say.
She felt the weight of Tallulah's words, felt the sadness and longing that accompanied them. She had never been forced to choose between two worlds, never had to let go of everything she knew to find something new. But she could see the toll it had taken on Tallulah, the uncertainty, the sense of loss.
I've never had to think about leaving everything behind, Catherine said softly.
I've always just stayed. And it's easier, in a way. But I don't know if it's the right thing. Tallulah turned to look at her then, her gaze steady and understanding. There's no right or wrong, Catherine. Sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. Breath. What feels right for you, even if it's not easy. It was then that Catherine realized the depth of what Tallulah had been through. She wasn't just someone who had been forced to leave her people behind. She was someone who had to carry that weight alone, without a place to call home, without the support of her community. Catherine had never known that kind of hardship, that kind of isolation. The days that followed were filled with the usual routine of ranch life, feeding the animals, fixing fences, tending to the house. But Catherine could sense a shift between them. It was subtle, a quiet tension that neither woman spoke about, but both felt. Catherine had begun to question what their growing closeness meant. She had never allowed herself to rely on anyone, had never allowed anyone to fill the space left by her husband. But with Tallulah, it was different. She couldn't explain it, but she felt something inside her stirring, something she hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, as they worked together to gather firewood, Catherine found herself watching Tallulah from across the clearing. Tallulah moved with a quiet strength, lifting the logs effortlessly, her broad shoulders gliding with each movement. She was a force of nature, and Catherine couldn't help but feel drawn to her in a way that was both comforting and unsettling.
Tallulah,
Catherine said, her voice soft. I've been thinking about everything. Tallulah stopped what she was doing, turning to face her. What about? I don't know, Catherine said, shaking her head. I guess I'm just confused. I never expected this. I never expected to feel this way. Tallulah's expression softened, and she set the firewood down before taking a step closer.
it's okay to be confused, she said gently.
You're not alone in that. We all have moments where we question everything, where we don't know what the right thing to do is.
Catherine swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She hadn't realized how much she had been carrying, how much of her fear and uncertainty had been hidden behind her steady facade. I don't know if I'm ready for this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'm ready for, whatever this is.
Tallulah reached out, placing a hand gently on Catherine's arm.
The touch was warm, reassuring, and for a moment Catherine felt like she could finally exhale.
You don't have to be ready, Tallulah said softly.
Great. You just have to take it one step at a time. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just have to be here, together. Catherine's heart raced at the words, and for the first time she allowed herself to truly feel the depth of her emotions. She wasn't sure what the future held, what would become of their shared life on the ranch, but she knew one thing. She wasn't as alone as she had been before. The evening came quickly, and the two women sat by the fire, the crackling flames dancing in the hearth. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like a shared understanding, a quiet space where words weren't always necessary.
I'm glad you're here, Catherine said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was a sincerity in it that she couldn't hide.
I'm glad you came to my door that night. Tallulah's gaze softened, and she gave a small smile. I'm glad I came, too, she said, her voice low but filled with warmth. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I think I found something. Something I didn't even know I needed. The night stretched on, the two women sitting side by side in the warmth of the fire. There was no rush, no pressure. They simply shared the moment, the understanding that had grown between them. And for the first time in a long while, Catherine allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for the future. The days seemed to stretch on as Catherine and Tallulah worked together on the ranch, the rhythms of daily life blending into a quiet routine. The seasons were changing, and with them, the challenges of ranch life. The animals still needed tending, the fences needed mending, and the chores didn't stop, but now there was a sense of companionship in the work. Catherine had grown accustomed to Tallulah's presence, and the silence between them no longer felt heavy or strained. It was a silence born of comfort, of understanding. Tallulah had become an indispensable part of Catherine's life, not just in the physical work she helped with, but in the emotional space she filled. Catherine had never imagined that a person could bring so much warmth into her life, especially not after all the years she had spent closing herself off from the world. But Tallulah had quietly, without force, broken down those walls, piece by piece. The more they worked side by side, the more Catherine found herself thinking about the future, about what it might hold for the two of them. One evening after a long day of work, the two of them sat on the porch, the last rays of sunlight casting a golden glow over the ranch. The air was crisp, and the quiet of the evening settled over them like a blanket. Catherine took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day lift as she relaxed into the chair beside Tallulah. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, breaking the peaceful silence, "about how different everything feels now. How easy it is to be with you." Tallulah glanced at her, her expression unreadable but soft. "It's strange, isn't it?" she replied quietly. "How we can come from such different worlds and still find something to hold on to." Breaths. "I never thought I'd be able to let someone in again after my husband passed." Breaths. "I was sure I'd spend the rest of my life alone. But now it feels different." Brit. "It feels like... I don't know. Like I'm part of something bigger, even though it's just us." There was a pause. A silence that was not uncomfortable, but filled with an understanding that neither woman needed to voice. Tallulah's presence had become as much a part of the ranch as the land itself. It was hard to imagine a time when she wasn't there. Hard to think about the empty spaces that used to define Catherine's life. "I never thought I'd find peace in a place like this," Tallulah said, her voice quieter now, almost as if speaking the words out loud made them more real. "I've always been a wanderer, always searching for something, but I never knew what that something was. I thought it was a place to call home, but maybe it's not about the place. Maybe it's about the people we share it with."
Catherine turned to face her, her heart swelling with emotion.
There was something about Tallulah's words that resonated deep within her. She had spent so many years thinking that she was meant to be alone, that her solitude was something she had to accept. But now, with Tallulah by her side, she began to understand that maybe the loneliness was something she could leave behind.
Maybe there was more to life than just surviving.
"I don't know what the future holds," Catherine said softly, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But I know I don't want to face it alone." Breaths. "I don't want to go back to how it was before." Tallulah's gaze softened, and she reached out, placing a hand gently on Catherine's arm. The touch was warm, reassuring, and Catherine felt a sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't just the physical warmth from the fire or the late afternoon sun. It was the quiet strength Tallulah offered, the kind of strength that didn't need words to be understood. "You don't have to go back," Tallulah said quietly. "We're here, together." The words hung in the air, simple and powerful, Breath. Catherine had never felt such certainty in her life, not since the days when she and her husband had shared the ranch, when everything had felt more certain, more stable. But now, that certainty came from a different source, one that wasn't tied to the land or to what she had known in the past. It came from the connection she had found with Tallulah, the unspoken bond that had grown between them. In the days that followed, Catherine allowed herself to let go of the fear that had kept her so isolated for so long. She had spent years building walls around herself, afraid to let anyone in. But now she felt as though she was slowly tearing those walls down, brick by brick. The world outside still seemed large and unpredictable, but with Tallulah by her side, it didn't feel as overwhelming. There was a comfort in knowing that no matter what came, they would face it together. The work on the ranch never stopped. They had more animals to care for, more fences to mend, and more tasks to complete. But now, the work felt less like a burden. They worked together in the fields, side by side. As the days turned to weeks, there were moments of laughter, moments of quiet reflection, and moments when neither of them needed to say anything at all. It was enough just to be in each other's company. As the days grew longer and the seasons shifted, Catherine realized that she was no longer just surviving. Breath. She was living. She was no longer alone, and that made all the difference. Brash. She had found something she had thought lost forever: companionship, trust, and a sense of belonging. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. One afternoon as the sun began to set, Catherine and Tallulah stood by the barn, looking out over the land. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the colors reflecting off the rolling hills. It was one of those moments when the beauty of the world seemed to wrap around them, a quiet reminder of how much had changed in such a short time.
"You've become part of this place," Catherine said softly, her voice full of wonder.
"You've become part of my life." Tallulah turned to her, her expression gentle. But there was a depth in her eyes that spoke volumes.
"I've always been a part of this place," she said, her voice calm and steady.
I just didn't know it yet.
He glances around in desperate. Catherine smiled, her heart full as she looked at Tallulah. There were still uncertainties ahead, still challenges to face, but for the first time in a long time Catherine felt ready. She felt as though she could face whatever came next, because she didn't have to do it alone. Tallulah was there by her side, and together they could weather any storm. The night came quietly, the stars slowly appearing overhead as the sky darkened. The two of them stood there side by side, their hands brushing briefly before they both turned to head inside the warmth of the house. There were no words needed between them. In that moment, everything they had shared, everything they had come to understand, was enough. As they entered the house, Catherine felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fire was warm, the house felt full, and for the first time in years, Catherine felt like she had a place in the world. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. It was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Catherine could say with certainty that she wasn't alone anymore.